think that's time for us to start. So why don't we get underway with our session. And so I'll say good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is truly a global event with delegates from 97 countries. And so this is a very appropriate virtual setting for our discussion today. We're gathering as well at a very important point in the progress of the pandemic. COVID-19 vaccine development has proceeded at an astonishing pace, and the very promising results that have been reported out of vaccine trials in recent weeks have brought the likely timelines and the shape of the pandemic recovery into sharper focus. Indeed, we woke up this morning to news that the UK has just approved the first of those vaccines, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and that its immunization program will begin next week. This is a remarkable achievement, to say the least. I mean, never before has a vaccine been developed so quickly. Even so, I think we are all increasingly understanding that there is no sharp finish line here as such. The global vaccination effort will unfold over 2021 and into 22, most likely. We'll be living with COVID-19 for some time yet. So what then does this all mean for international student mobility and for global higher education in particular? That's our focus today. And I want to emphasize that we're going to take a longer term view in this discussion. We're looking ahead to that period really after the pandemic subsides, and we're trying to understand better how student mobility will take shape in the years ahead and how higher education institutions and higher education systems around the world will continue to respond. If we haven't had a chance to meet before, I'll just say quickly that I'm Craig Riggs. I'm the editor of ICEF Monitor, and we've spent our days this year, as I'm sure you all have too, trying to understand how the market is adapting and responding to the pandemic, how we're all moving forward. If you're not already a regular Monitor reader, it's my sworn duty to invite you to visit icefmonitor.com today to subscribe for free email alerts for our ongoing coverage. Much more importantly, I'm delighted to introduce the distinguished panel that we have for our discussion today. Joining us is Allan Goodman, who's the CEO of the Institute of International Education, or IIE. And he's based in New York, but as we find him today in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where I understand the internet is vastly superior to that of the big city. Thanks, Allan. And then we have Alex Usher as well. Alex is the president of Higher Education Strategy Associates, and he's joining us from Toronto. And we have Vivienne Stern, who is the director of the Universities UK International in London, and joining us from just outside Woburn House, where it looks like a lovely, lovely afternoon there indeed, Vivienne. So thank you all for joining us and sharing your insights with the audience today. And speaking of the audience, I'd like to invite everyone on the session to share any questions or issues that you like in the chat with us. We'll do our best to tackle any that we can during the session. And if we run out of time, we'll follow up with you afterwards by email and try to make sure we respond to everyone's questions one way or the other. We're going to spend most of this hour in an open discussion just amongst the panel, but I'd like to ask each of you just to weigh in for a couple of minutes in our opening question. I wonder if you could tell us really what is your outlook through, let's say, 2025? Should we expect recovery and continued growth in international student mobility, or are we entering a period of declining student numbers? Either way, what do you see as some of the factors that are really going to drive those long-term trends going forward? So there's our question today. Outlook through 2025. Vivienne, would you like to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the difficulty of going first here is that I might recalibrate my response depending on what others say. I have to also declare that as a terrible, hopeless optimist that I feel relatively positive about the longer term outlook for two reasons. One is that the short term impact on mobility of the COVID crisis has been much less severe than we expected at the beginning of the crisis. I mean, we were talking to universities in the UK who were modelling up to 80% decreases in international enrolments, and it has been nowhere near like that. I mean, we've seen institutions, and not an insignificant number of institutions in the UK, grow enrolments in the admissions round that we've just had. That's not the picture across the board. I think most, just over half of the institutions in the UK have seen decreases, but it's not nearly as bad as we thought it would be. And then the sort of very much longer term perspective out to your sort of 2025 horizon. I think that my guess is that there will remain people who are highly motivated to study internationally in systems that are renowned for excellence. And on the policy level, the UK government has finally fixed a whole bunch of things that were making us a pretty unattractive destination. So I think those are two reasons to be positive in the longer term. There is a big question in my mind about what happens in the short to medium term, though, because the affordability of international education has to be surely hit by the economic catastrophe, and I think it is a catastrophe that will follow the pandemic. And I don't know anybody who can really predict the consequence of that.
Yeah, fair points. Alex, what's the take from Toronto on this opening question?
My take is pretty close to Vivienne's, I think. I mean, a couple things. I mean, in Canada, we actually have a number of institutions where international enrollments are up this year. And I think one of the things the pandemic is laying bare is that there is a big difference in the elasticity of demand for prestige education. That is, broadly speaking, can you credibly claim a spot in the world top 500? And, what you would call sort of maybe more immigration motivated higher education. So we've had huge increases in Canada in the number of international students coming to community colleges for the last year. Well, those numbers are down significantly, and they're down in the kind of ways that you're seeing in Australia too. So I think this is, you know what I mean? Like, I think that the market is becoming much more segregated, and that will probably, as Vivienne intimated, I mean, I think that will probably stay true for another 2 or 3 years. Look, we were going to go through a flattening of demand anyway, right? I mean, the China market was not going to keep, sort of leveled out a number of years ago anyway. And the India market, there are limits on how far that's going to grow, right? Like their increase in youth numbers is not is coming to an end, and those two are sort of 60-70% of most of the big exporters markets. So it was hard to see how we were going to increase ever. If I can maybe throw in two things that I think are really important, which are not COVID related. I mean, one, the growing Cold War with China is going to affect everybody, right? I mean, I think this is serious stuff. I mean, they have quarrels in various ways, Australia and Canada and the United States. And I think that is going to change things. And I think the only one of the major exporting countries, I guess two major exporting countries that are going to escape that are probably New Zealand and the UK. The other thing to look for is that you've got a demographic bust coming in the United States. And it's starting to make itself felt already. American institutions are going to be absolutely starving for fee-paying students. And I expect the way that those institutions are going to up their game in the international level is going to surprise everybody over the next 4 or 5 years. And I don't think that changes the size of the market, but it changes the competitive dynamics for places like Canada and the UK and Australia.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating points. I mean, I think that's one of the huge questions for us as we start to look ahead now, is how is that competitive dynamic going to change over the next decade? And I think you're pointing to a couple of pretty important factors there. Allan, what say you in terms of the medium term outlook?
3 things. So first, complete agreement. I think the points that Vivienne and Alex have made are spot on in terms of what we have to look forward to and where the challenges are. Secondly, this is the 12th pandemic in IIE's history. We were founded in the middle of the Spanish influenza. We were founded in 1919. And I'm struck that after every pandemic, our industry is among the first to resume. International mobility always grows. Students have been ready with pent-up demand and plans that have been deferred and postponed to do international education. And I think nothing has changed about those dynamics. In terms of programs we administer, like the Fulbright program on behalf of the US Department of State, applications are at 20-year highs, which demonstrates that students from all around the world and Americans thinking about all around the world are ready to go when it's safe to go. The third point really is a question. Will we have a reformation? Because the issues of access, the issues of cost, the issue of credit transfer, the issue of what's able to be taken remotely, the issue of enrollment in a university in New York City, but I'm taking all the courses from my home in Korea or some part of South America. Will we reform enough to cope with the surge in demand, short and medium term, that I forecast will have? And those systems that do attack these issues will have the lion's share of academic mobility in the future.
Really, what do you, I mean, really interesting, and really very much in line with I think a lot of the discussion that is starting to gather momentum around the world in terms of people use terms like reset and building back better, and the pandemic as an opportunity to sort of reinvent how we do things. What do you see as ingredients of or likely ingredients of a reformation in higher education?
Well, I think hybrid is a word that's going to be with us for a long time. The way in the last decade, transnational education was the new word about expanding international education. Universities everywhere are going to take advantage of, cope with, be prepared for a hybrid environment, and it's different than building a campus overseas. It's different than TNE. The race will go to the SWIFT. The race will go to the universities that are prepared to pivot this way. And if anything, the pandemic has taught higher education in all of our countries that we can pivot. And maybe a silver lining is that it's given us a playbook for how to pivot that will help us cope with the hybrid world. But there will be another pandemic. There will be another regional, if not global, health crisis. And one of the things this has done is taught us all to have the handbook in our desk drawer that says, okay, it's on us. What do we do in day one, week one, month one, year one? And that'll be part of coping with the next crisis, but making sure that we take advantage of all we've learned that's good about being hybrid, being virtual, and having webinars like this.
Yeah. You know, we've all learned some new tricks, that's for sure. We all spent a lot more time on webinars this year than we did in the past. But I mean, I think those are fascinating opening points, I think, for all of us. Why don't we go back to the question of competitive dynamic for a minute? Because I mean, I think we have seen in different ways an intensifying of competition in international student markets over the last decade. And there's some broad patterns we've certainly been tracking over that period in terms of destinations, right? Some of the familiar headlines are sort of slowing growth in terms of foreign enrollment in the US and the UK, the traditional leaders certainly, and very much still the leading destinations in the world. Increasing share for Australia and Canada during that period, as Alex alluded to earlier. And the growing prominence of regional destinations, I mean, not least of which is China, speaking of a changing dynamic there. But Alex, I mean, you kind of opened this can of worms in your opening remarks. So let's turn to you first. I mean, how do you see that competitive landscape taking shape, continuing to take shape over the next several years?
I'm not sure it's China that everybody needs. I mean, so there are bigger numbers going into China, but from everything I've seen, those are not full degree students, right? There's a lot of short-term language work going there. So I mean, it still counts, but it's not. It's a different kind of market, and I don't think that. So their numbers are rising, but I don't think they're actually increasing share. You know, there are some countries that do try to play this game in different ways. Malaysia, obviously, but you know, Malaysia has there's limits to what a country like Malaysia can do. Singapore tried to play an international game and stopped because housing pressures.
Yeah.
And you kind of get a sense that New Zealand, in effect, is one of the reasons they're backing away from at least some parts of the market, is they are worried about property prices in Auckland in particular. And I think the British Columbia government here in Canada, I think, has been wary about getting too far into this for exactly the same reason in the Lower Mainland around Vancouver. To get to the point raised earlier about whether or not international distance education becomes a bigger play, that's an interesting one, right? I mean, again, take a look at Canada. Our numbers went up at the prestige institutions, but it's not because people could come here, right? Because we basically had a hold on new visas for quite some time now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think maybe there is a market for, instead of coming to the University of Toronto and paying $35,000 a year plus the airfare plus living in Toronto, maybe there's a market for a $35,000 University of Toronto degree, but you take it in Shanghai or in, Bangalore or wherever. I don't think anybody knows that. Right. I mean, genuinely, that's not a market that has been, what's the product you'd get? I don't know. I mean, one of the interesting things from the Canadian perspective is because our universities shut down hard in March and have never reopened for most undergraduate training, or most undergraduate education, we now have our entire system now works remotely, and every single professor can work remotely. Most of them hate it, but a number of them, can see the possibilities. And so I think we actually, the big competitive advantage for Canada maybe is that if there is a big market for remote education, which exists for price reasons, right? Then I think we've got a much bigger group of trained professionals to do that than the countries who have stayed open, or the countries who have, like the United States, they've sort of gone back and forth between open and closed. Anyway, so I mean, I think that's the one big question mark, is what does this do for the demand for remote training from elite institutions?
Yeah, that capacity for online learning, or that the developing playbook for that, as Allan referred to earlier, is certainly something that's building in many countries that are traditional receivers of international students. I mean, but Vivienne, the UK has been a leader in that space for a long time in terms of transnational education and the number of students enrolled in British credentials offshore. And so do you think that figures more prominently in higher ed delivery for British institutions going forward?
I think it'll open up possibilities in transnational education that I think could be actually, quite exciting, because transnational education in its sort of in its many forms tends to be very expensive for universities to develop and deliver with any sort of degree of quality. The sort of glamorous end of it, the branch campus, is just a total money pit for most institutions. If you want to collaborate genuinely with a kind of peer institution in the delivery of a program, there's huge costs and a lot of complexity involved in getting faculty to go and spend time delivering education outside their home country. I mean, it's probably fun the first few times you do it, and much less fun the 45th time you're spending, yet another 5-week period or 4-week period in a, faceless or anonymous Marriott somewhere. What seems to me possible, the speed with which the acceptance of blended delivery has been, we've seen a transformation in people's willingness to not only accept blended delivery or fully online delivery, but also their appreciation of its plus points. It's not just a kind of poor relation. It's not just the thing that you do because you can't meet face to face. There are actually positive benefits of it. I think that, if I took off, the small idealist in me thinks that what will happen, if I ever got my hands on a university's international strategy, what I would do is I would I would pot around the world finding universities that were absolutely brilliant in a slightly different area of something that we were really brilliant at, putting together programs that allow my students to come through our door and gain access to the absolute best in a range of aspects of a particular discipline. So say I'm teaching marine biology, you know, and I don't know, I know nothing about marine biology, but say, you know, my academic community is totally world leading when it comes to, you know, the sort of the ocean floor or something like that. But I want somebody who, you know, can teach the module that's on, you know, Antarctic ecosystems or something like that. I mean, I'm making this all up, and I apologize to any marine biologists over there. Isn't that exciting? The idea that we can, I know it's already happening, and there have been experiments and institutions building these sort of star alliances, and there's an experiment going on in Europe around university networks. But if you don't have to sort of export staff in that way, if students are willing to, you know, are kind of unfussed about studying partly online and partly face-to-face, then I think it opens up some exciting possibilities. The only other thing I would say, though, and what will be interesting is whether, you know, how bouncy are we? You know, do we actually, is it that the sector broadly snaps back to where it was kind of pretty comfortable before? Will the kind of, you know, bounciness depend on the kind of pandemic that you've just had? Because in the UK, frankly, it's been predominantly blended. I mean, this term is basically blended. Most students are on campus, they're getting some contact time. In some disciplines, it's more than others. But in Canada, the experience is pretty different. You're probably, you know, you've invested perhaps in online learning in a way that maybe our guys haven't. I had a conversation with the Vice Chancellor yesterday. He said his big task in the next sort of 6 months is going to stop his academics going back to doing what they were doing before. So I think that there are questions about how much people will snap back to what they were comfortable with, and how much they'll think, hey, we can do something we never imagined would be possible, or we only did before because we quite liked going to Malaysia. I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see.
It's very tempting for me to hand this back to Allan to extend on the Reformation theme from earlier, but I think I want to just stick with the question of the competitive landscape. Just it's a personal interest of mine, and I think that it's something that, you know, we have seen a number of study destinations increasing their marketing recruitment efforts in recent years, and we see, as Alex alluded to earlier, we see more regional players in particular coming into the market and attempting to recruit more students. I mean, the U.S., Allan, obviously the traditional leading destination in the world, and has been for some time. You know, but its competitiveness has eroded somewhat over the last several years. Like, you know, as we, you know, because of domestic demographics or otherwise, like, do you see U.S. higher education moving to a different footing in terms of its competitiveness going forward?
I was actually thinking of picking up on the other R word, not reformation, but regional, that I think will really define the landscape, at least in the short term after the pandemic is controlled or over. If you think of the league tables, the 100 top universities in the world, or the 250 top universities, and if you think of it from the perspective of a student or parent that has resources, but in their region, 3 hours or less away by air flight is a top 100 or a top 250 university, we may see decisions being driven by, well, maybe it's better to stay next year closer to home. Maybe it's better to take advantage of what's in our regions. And after all, there are plenty of people teaching in those top 100 or 250 that have PhDs from Canada, the UK, America, and have gone back home to be their professors. So I think as international education resumes, and I think it will be much bigger than we currently forecast it to be, it will also be much more regional, and there are more opportunities And also, some of those opportunities are far less expensive than a full degree for a full fee-paying foreign student in Canada, the US, or the UK. So I think regionalism is possible after the pandemic in a way that it really wasn't possible before.
Just people choosing more affordable or closer to home destinations.
And maybe the two decisions are related because the pandemic has produced huge anxieties. Hundreds of thousands of students, international students in America, in Canada, in the UK were stranded and couldn't take the 12-hour flight home to Korea, Taiwan, Beijing, you name it. And just as Americans were stranded in continental Europe or in Asia. And that anxiety imprints on our brains some. And when you begin thinking about my only son or my only daughter or a young person, you may want them much closer to home in the region than a 12-hour flight away dependent on intercontinental air service. Mm-hmm. So I think regionalism is going to figure in decision-making much more prominently than it ever has before.
Yeah, I mean, does that mean that institutions in some of those traditional destinations, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, does that mean that they're essentially recruiting from a smaller pool of prospective students?
It's not possible yet to know because the destination universities that we're all thinking of have enormous alumni networks in the regions, in the countries, and they're the best salespeople for a UK education, a Canadian education, a USA education. And those alumni networks are not going to be any less enthusiastic about a degree from Queen's University or LSE or UCal, Davis, let alone Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, Toronto. And I think we'll see a use of alumni and alumni networking that will enable the traditional destination universities to still get the students they want. And I think the demographic boom in many countries will produce a surplus of well-qualified students for higher education that can't be satisfied inside one country and maybe not even inside one region. And Alex has got a very key point about China as a destination. There's no question it can be a big destination. There's no question that it has tens of thousands of scholarships, especially for students from South America and from other parts of Asia. But does it have full degree programs as opposed to short-term or language programs? And we don't yet have all the Chinese figures to know how much is the flow to China for what all of us would think of as classical higher education, a bachelor's, a master's, and how much are more short-term focused programs that boost China's numbers as a destination. Mm-hmm. But it's not exactly the same as saying China is replacing any of the countries on this panel as the number one or number two host country for higher education as we know it.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair point. What about the supply? I mean, just a question to the panel. I mean, what about the supply side of that, of the China question? I mean, China's obviously been the main driver of growth in terms of global mobility for decades now, giving way over the last decade to India in terms of a growth driver. But there are plenty of indications, and again, there's, whether it's political or trade tensions with other destinations or what have you, there are plenty of indications that the outbound Chinese market is cooling. If that's the case, where is growth coming from next? Where's that next wave of students coming from to drive continued growth in the future?
Well, I mean, it seems unlikely to me that there is another country like China that could take its place as a dominant force in student flows around the world. But in some respects, I think that's something that we should see as a positive thing, because most of the major international recruiters are over dependent on Chinese students, and that's a risk. It's a risk in terms of financial sustainability, but it's also a reputational risk, a risk in terms of quality of education, because students are promised an international education, and if they find that it isn't a real, if they're in a classroom that is not as diverse as the one they were expecting, then I think you begin to get a kind of reputational impact from that. So, and although the UK hasn't got quite the frosty relationship with China that some other countries do at the moment, our government's very interested in supporting diversification amongst international student populations. And on that score, just to go back to the TNE point, there isn't a hard line between higher education delivered outside of the providing country and onshore recruitment. I mean, a lot of what UK universities do is create a pathway for people to spend one part of their studies in the UK. So perhaps, and it's a lower cost option that also gives you the opportunity to experience British life and culture, to sit in a physical space alongside people from around the world. So I think there can be ways of using transnational education to help with the kind of diversification challenge.
Allan, Alex, any thoughts on where, if it's not China, where that growth comes from in the future?
I mean, I'm not sure there was, like I said, even in the old model, pre-COVID, I don't think there was a lot of growth left in the traditional system, provided you saw it as people moving from country A to country B. The growth was driven partly by demographics and partly by income. I mean, you got to remember the Chinese numbers were international outbound numbers, kept growing well after the baby bust, right? So, I mean, the number of people taking the Gaokao in China has been going down for almost 15 years. It might have started growing again, but it fell by a third. And yet the international numbers kept going up. Why? Because the country kept getting richer. Right. You don't see a lot of countries having that kind of explosive growth. The stuff we saw in Southeast Asia and Taiwan and Singapore and South Korea in the 80s and 90s, and what we saw in China and to a lesser extent India in the 2000s, 2010s. There's no countries coming up behind them with that kind of explosive growth. So I don't foresee any new countries that way. Doesn't mean you can't deepen the growth by providing cheaper alternatives. And I think this is, Vivienne's getting at this with the transnational stuff and the partnership stuff. I suspect you'll probably see more institutions try to do what, I never actually followed this one up, but University of Arizona a few years ago came up with this idea of global micro campuses, right? They were going to set up 25 of these global micro campuses around the world. Gets around all those problems Vivienne was talking about developing a branch campus and all those kinds of issues. And you can develop some really interesting partnerships around those things. I wonder how many big institutions will start doing that. I wonder if you will start seeing much more genuine transnational delivery. That is, if you could imagine a network of 20 institutions in different parts of the world, in effect, the airline alliance is the one everyone talks about. I'm not sure it's the best metaphor because hopefully you don't do as many undergraduate degrees as you take flights. So it's not a loyalty thing, right? But the idea that there are interconnections between those campuses and but regulation is going to take a while to catch up to that, right? I mean, I just think that how do you accredit courses? How do you accredit degrees? It'll be tricky. But that's the growth. If there's growth, it is going to be in that transnational part and not the simple importing, moving bodies from point A to point B.
Interesting.
It's a little bit more to the mix that if I were president of a university or vice chancellor of one in the UK, the first thing I do after the pandemic is set up our overseas office in India. India is another place that has the demographics, the wealth, the population, the admiration for the type of education all three of our countries and societies provide. And India has actually had up and down growth over the past 5 years, but it has the potential to be as significant to our future international education as China has been for the past decade. I buy a morning paper in Cape Cod from a gas station just outside the village. It's run by an Indian gentleman. He's brought 27 of his relatives to come to school in America. Runs a gas station, but they've gone to the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. They've gone to Cape Cod Community College. And you can't travel in the United States these days without encountering an Indian, a Nigerian, an Ethiopian between our service industries, our gas stations, our 7-Elevens, our pharmacies. And by universities reaching out to those societies, you will be tapping in already to the pipeline that says bringing the rest of the family here, whether the here is Canada, whether the here is the UK, or the here is the United States. There is something that attracts people to our societies, and we need them. We need the anesthesiologist who comes from Taiwan, the cardiologist from Egypt, the pharmacist from Pakistan or Nigeria, the entrepreneur from India. And so in our societies, there is a place, maybe uniquely, for that path of immigration, but that path is fueled by education and the demographics of South Asia.
So I mean, you're invoking a couple of things there, and one is that idea of sort of immigration-fueled study planning, right? So the students that, and India being a perfect example of that, a market that has shown itself to be very agile, moving among destinations in terms of which have the most attractive post-study work and settlement offers. You know, Vivienne, the UK has obviously taken some important steps in that respect. You know, whereas we've seen, so this is an aspect of competitiveness, I suppose. You know, Canada has attracted more Indian students because we've had legitimate postgraduate work and settlement opportunities for those graduates. Those programs in the US have come under more scrutiny and have become somewhat more restricted in recent years. The UK has, as I say, has introduced its own postgraduate study option, or sorry, work option, and has seen its popularity spike in some of those markets as a result. I mean, part of the strength of the enrollment numbers this year that you cited earlier, Vivienne, I think could be directly traced back to that 2-year offer. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not the full story, because remember, we had a 2-year post-study work visa, which was eliminated in 2012. So there's a balancing act always, I think, in all our systems between providing opportunities for international graduates to stay and work after they study and retaining the kind of political support for international students. And it's a really delicate balancing act. And we've been warned by our own Home Office, with whom we now have a fantastic relationship, having been sort of at loggerheads for more or less the last decade, to pay attention to some of the enrolment patterns in Canadian institutions, particularly because they said, if you look at the demographic of some of the applicants to Canadian institutions, it just raises questions about whether those are individuals who are motivated by the traditional drivers to study, or whether they're actually, you know, the degree as a minor inconvenience in an immigration plan. And we have to watch that we don't end up with a kind of boom and bust. So our strategic objective now is maintain stability in visa policy and make sure that, you know, the things that Allan talked about, we know that the people who come and study in the UK have a lot to offer if they stay and work. But we have to be able to demonstrate that that those individuals who stay in our economy are a real net benefit to the UK. Fortunately, right now, we have a government that thinks that the kind of human connections built up through student flows is a huge diplomatic asset. And given that they've made life a little bit more difficult for themselves by removing themselves from the European Union, that is regarded as rather important. But the wind will change, and particularly in a climate in which we'll have, enormous economic and sort of financial pressures at the level of the individual. I think we have to be alive to the possibility that the public support for immigration of all types is reduced. So we have to really watch our kind of blind side on that.
And somehow higher education seems to be in the middle of that conversation around when it comes to international mobility, when it comes to that social license for international students in the country.
Yeah, and I think there's good reason for it, because and this is the kind of thing I don't think people in our sector say enough, that the way that we talk about education when we're talking about domestic populations and the way that we talk about education when we're thinking about international students are different. And we've reconciled that in our own minds. We talk comfortably about students as an economic, international education as an important economic sector. We know that we're recruiting predominantly very privileged individuals, maybe not to such a great extent in the US where there is greater support for tuition, but in the UK, although there are scholarship and bursaries on offer, that's not commonly available. Mm-hmm. And we don't really manage to reconcile that. And I think that I can imagine a time we're coming into a demographic peak in the UK. So universities are about to be hit by my 10-year-old son's cohort, who are a kind of demographic boom. I think it's an echo boom from the post-war baby boom. And when they go to university in 8 years' time, there will be lots of people who are sort of tremendously upset that Jemima from Hertfordshire can't get into the top flight Russell Group University of her choice. And we'll be asking why all these sort of students from other parts of the world seemingly can. And I think we just also have to be alive to the fact that we are operating in two very different political environments.
Yeah, I think very true. Given that, and given the, in each of you in your earlier remarks has suggested different ways in which higher education institutions will be almost compelled to diversify in the future in terms of the nationality of their students, in terms of the modes of delivery in which they're serving those students. Given all that, like, how do you see, I mean, this is a sector that has some really well-established, almost routinized practices for student recruitment, for example. How do you see student recruitment changing, and that whole proposition of how students are attracted to institution X or Y changing as we go ahead?
Well, even before the pandemic, we changed the paradigm from we've built it and they'll come to if we want them to come, we need to figure out who, where, and why, and reach out to them. Fortunately, all of our countries have universities that have huge alumni networks, and we've been able to mobilize them, especially when recruiters can't travel or fairs are now only virtual. So I think we've laid the roadwork for a post-pandemic global effort, but it means every university has also got to have its own foreign policy. Where do we want to be active? Where do we want to attract students? How do they relate to our own local community here at home? And then how do we get them?
But you see that shift in the U.S., Allan. I used to be struck. This is, and I'm not disagreeing with you, because I see some evidence of that in my visits there as well. But I used to be struck by a phrase that I heard in the States that I never heard anywhere else, which was armchair recruiting. People used to talk about armchair recruiting, like you would just, as you say, it was that more like we've built it and they'll come approach, more of a passive recruitment approach. And it sounds like you're observing more of a shift towards a sort of more active recruitment posture.
As a result of the pandemic and the recognition of how important international students are for a variety of reasons to American campuses and communities, all of our surveys are indicating that universities, public, private, large, small, are actually redoubling their efforts in anticipation of the pandemic ending. And that's a really good thing, because you can't just rely on a traditional pipeline, or you just can't rely on, as you characterized it so well, armchair recruiting.
Yeah. What do you think, Alex? How's the recruitment side of international education going to change?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm particularly well placed to comment on it. I don't have a strong sense, but my guess, I mean, for one thing, I think, if what Allan's talking about, I would argue UK and Canada were already there, right? So I think that you're probably Allan's describing a shift in the US that they may be trailing other countries in to begin with. But it's going to depend a lot on what the bounce back looks like. I mean, if you have a very strong, if it turns out international students have a very strong bias towards travel, right? They want to be at a university. They don't just want the education. They don't want to log on and get the education. They want to be in the country. They want to be on campus. They want the personal experience. Why would anything change? Right? Like I'm not convinced that we know how it's going to change. And I think there's a lot of indecision about how to do recruitment this year, because we're not completely sure how the vaccine's going to roll out, right? And in different, I mean, in Canada, I would say we're probably looking at about June before life gets back to normal, because there's enough vaccine in the system that the vulnerable are protected, right? We're probably looking about May or June, at which point, societally will be back to normal, because if you protect that, sort of 30%, this, COVID's kind of like H1N1, and we did fine with no closures then, right? So I think our campuses are probably open in the fall, but we don't know for sure. And I think that's where the real trick is for this year, which is how do you, I mean, the great thing about what Canada did in the spring was it gave certainty to international students in the fall. We said, forget it, right? Not September, and a few of them even by August had said it's not going to be January anyway. So that gave a lot of certainty. We're in a bit of uncertainty now about what next year looks like. But my guess is the year after that, we're pretty much back to normal.
Yeah, the thing that I find myself thinking a lot about in the midst of all that uncertainty is the point that Allan alluded to earlier, is that student mobility, the historical pattern is very clear. It surges after a disruption, as we're experiencing right now. And we see an awful lot of indication across markets of continuing strong demand for in-person learning opportunities. And indeed, we were just writing about this on Monitor last week, that a recent survey that points to the increasing willingness of students to even shift their study plans from one destination to another if they perceive an opportunity to pursue in-person learning in an alternate destination. And I wonder what that tells us about. I was thinking about what you were all saying earlier about online learning and the new models that are going to emerge from the playbook that we're all building this year. But just in our remaining moments, I'm trying, as thinking about all the important themes that you're introducing today, I'm wondering how internationalization is likely to change from next year on. I think we've probably touched on some of the important elements of it in terms of an expansion of hybrid learning opportunities, perhaps a more sophisticated idea of transnational education, as Vivienne described earlier, where institutions are more selectively partnering, with areas of complementary strengths to deliver new opportunities to domestic and international students. But I mean, what do you expect international higher education 5 or 10 years from now to look very similar to what we see today, or do you think we're really going to see more of a reformation, as Allan alluded to earlier?
I'd bet that we will have a reformation, but it's also a 10-year process.
Yeah.
My sense is that one of the benefits of the experience we've just lived through is the realization that universities can be far more flexible than they thought they could be, and far more adaptable to individual circumstances. So in the UK, we have students doing all sorts of things. I mean, we've got students who are on campus turning up for face-to-face tuition in some subjects. We've got students in the same cohort who are self-isolating in their accommodation, and students in the same cohort who are studying in a different time zone from their home country. We've got much greater variety of start dates. So it was quite normal for there to be a big intake in September and a smaller intake in January. Now we've got February starts, March starts, you know, there will be a lot more flexibility. And I think that Alex was right to mention all of the kind of regulatory hurdles that will arise as a result of that step away from a pretty standardized model to something that is much more responsive to the individual circumstances of groups of customer, frankly. But there will be enormous benefits to it from the student perspective. I think the other thing that all of the pressures that have been described should deliver is an increased focus on the kind of the experiences of students and levels of satisfaction, because frankly we'll compete in this competitive environment if we're better than the alternatives, including the regional alternatives. And if you're going to pay a lot of money to come to a prestigious UK university, you know, we have to treat you well while you're here, and we have to make good on the promise, I think, of that education in terms of career. So I think that's where I'd see the attention going. At least that's where I hope the attention will go.
Do you see evidence of that, like amongst colleagues at institutions around the country? Like, do you see any kind of shift in orientation or focus in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were terrified of the consequences of this recruitment cycle, and there are people in universities right across the sector, you know, who bust every possible sinew to make sure that whatever the new problem was, they fixed it. I mean, the extent of you know, flexibility, creativity, adaptability. I think there is an awful lot to be proud of, and it's not. I'm not just, I think, talking about the UK. I think that's been true in lots of systems around the world.
Mm-hmm. Alex, your crystal ball is just out of view outside the camera frame there. But what do you think the future holds in terms of any change in our basic models of international higher ed?
I think the one piece that we haven't included in this conversation so far is the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. And I think that has taken, in the last 5 years, that has really started to shape the global discussion about what higher education is for, right? And I think, you know, the fact that the Times Higher Education, you know, now has a ranking, what they call an impact ranking, which is largely based around it, is both a symptom of and a driver of, you know, increased attention to these models. So I think part of the internationalization discussion is increasingly going to get caught up in the SDGs. It's a way that institutions can show relevance, and I think the political economy of research universities in particular is forcing them to find new ways to describe relevance. And these are some useful organizing principles. They're also useful organizing principles for finding partners in other parts of the world, right? Like, which of the SDGs does your institution really take seriously? Well, that's actually, you know, if you had a global register of that, then it'd be really easy to sort of pick out, oh, okay, that's a good constellation working on SDG number 4. So that's one thing. And that will drive research agendas, and it will drive student agendas to some degree at the postgraduate level about where they want to study. And so I think that's a really important thing for the next few years. The other thing is, we tend to talk about internationalization as the result of campus level initiatives, right? Whether that's going out and recruiting students, or whether that's you know, creating international environments on campus, all that kind of stuff. I think what you miss when you talk about that is whatever internationalization goes in the classroom, which is not part of an institutional initiative. And I think one thing that I've seen in the pandemic, mainly among colleagues, is there's a lot of them, they say, well, look, if we're in Zoom anyway, why don't I share my Zoom class with my colleague in, in China or in India? Because, hey, we're all, synchronicity is going to make my class terrible for everyone anyway. I might as well, go make some other people miserable too. But I mean, if I've got a class of 30 in Toronto and somebody has a class of 30 in Hanoi, and we're mostly dealing with the same thing, why not do some joint sessions? And I think it's going to be individual professors finding ways to bring international experiences, possibly aligned with SDGs, possibly not, into the classroom. That's big. Like I think, and we're never going to find a way to measure it, right? Because we don't measure things that are going down at that really basic modular level of the university. But I do think that's going to change things quite a bit.
So international experiences in that almost informal linkages, like Oh, interesting.
I just think that these kinds of sessions on Zoom are now so normalized that people will go to them right away. And I think that, provided you can make it work, and provided, I think there's some countries that would really benefit from it, but the internet connectivity makes it difficult, Africa, I think. But that's probably a 4 or 5 year problem. That's not a decade-long problem. So I just think that I am very hopeful for that kind of internationalization. I think it will be really interesting.
Like a more organic grassroots expression of internationalization. Very interesting idea, and the idea of I guess it's part of the playbook that we're writing this year, Allan.
I think when Martin Luther nailed his edicts to the church door, he didn't anticipate that we would create different kinds of churches, different branches of religion, and I think we're all at that stage. We're on the edge of something. It may look very familiar post-pandemic, and it may have all the new characteristics we're talking about, and unlike things driven by ideology, none of us are driven by, we have a lock on truth, we have a vision of the future, we have a way of organizing higher education that everyone needs to subscribe to, and my country is bigger and better than yours. The pandemic's leveled the playing field. If we have a reformation, it will have very different characteristics for all of our systems, but none of us have a God-given insight into where we're going, and that's what makes our field dynamic and exciting.
I think that's a great point, and a great note for us to end on as we reach the top of the hour here. I think, I walked into this session with some half-formed ideas around some of these questions, and you've certainly helped me to polish those up a little bit, and I'm sure for everyone who's attending the session today. And I think in the midst of uncertainty and facing a future we can't see very clearly, we might as well lock arms together and figure out how to extend the playbook that we've all started writing this year. So big thanks to each of you for making time and for really making this discussion so fantastic today. I think we'll close out on that note and allow everyone to move on to their next appointments during the event. But thanks, Allan and Vivienne and Alex for giving us your time today. Bye for now.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Great to see you all.